kindred friends, and welcome to the Radical Emergence Podcast, where we're having conversations at the edge of transformation. We are your hosts. I'm Dr. Jen Pierre-Rich, and with me is my friend, co-host, and co-collaborator, Dr. Sally Adnams Jones. Please check out our bios in the show notes where you'll find links to our work, websites, and can find ways to connect with us. If you're not already following, hit that subscribe button, ring that bell, and join our mailing list so you can stay up to date on new episodes as they drop.
Hello, everybody. Sally here. This exciting project consists of about 26 episodes in all, dedicated to better defining and understanding transformation on all its levels of reality. That's personal, social, as well as ecological. We're going to ask, what is transformation? Why bother? Why do we need it? And what does it feel like or look like? We'll also ask, can we induce it or perhaps accidentally block it? These are really important questions for growth.
We draw not only on our hard-won life experience, we are also transdisciplinarians. So what the heck is that? Well, it means we want to understand transformation from as many lenses as possible, including formal academic disciplines and discourses, art, media, and popular culture. Importantly, we draw from our living experience.
So we are experts, so to speak, but mostly in just one small but highly critical area, our own suffering, and the medicines that we've both used to transform our own lives. So to this end, we've also added decades of committed practices, as well as formal degrees, including specific in-depth studies in the mechanisms of transformation, because we needed to understand this healing journey for ourselves.
Does this entitle us to help others? You bet. Absolutely. Because it is by sharing our stories, knowledge, and direct experience that we offer sane, sober, practical tools for living on the ground of life. So welcome. Strap in, hang on, and enjoy the ride as we deep dive into a universe of transformation.
Welcome back. We've had quite a journey so far. We've done 10 episodes together, and we have had this exploration, first of all, of transformation as a phenomenology, looking at evolution and how our identities are a creative fractal of that emergence of the universe and how that can come through our body. We've looked at creativity in depth, 3 or 4 episodes focusing on creativity itself, so that we're aligned with the nature of the universe, which is the great Creatrix. And then we looked last week at the motivations that can deepen and develop with our creativity, as not only do we grow up and wake up as transformation, but we show up. So part of learning how to access our creativity is, as we said, about healing trauma. It's also about connecting with community. It's also about finding our identity as a creatrix ourselves. It's about transformation of our world through our own empowerment. And today we're going to look at one specific aspect, which is under that creativity hood. Last week, we looked at the different chakras as a kind of a beautiful metaphor of how the body can be an instrument for creativity. And today we're going to focus on one in particular, the throat. In other words, the voice. The voice as transformation, not only of our agency and power, but of our world and the obligation we have to speak up and use this beautiful communication chakra and develop it and mature it and make it have impact. So I'm going to unpack that a little bit today. The voice as an enactment of our power and creativity residing at the throat chakra. So let's just take a look at voice itself. Voice is a bit like a hose pipe. You know, we have this beautiful esophagus and the throat, and it opens and it can emit sound like a hose pipe. It can just eject sound. When you're born, a little baby will just scream. And that is the natural energy release of the human body. When we're pre-verbal as a little human, we scream. And slowly we begin to master this throat and we begin to gurgle and chirp and make sounds. And by about the age of 2, we've moved from non-verbal or pre-verbal to verbal. And that is a massive development. Suddenly we can start communicating and exploring our needs and reaching out to others and making our private world visible to others, specifically the family first, and then as we go to school, our community, and then politically, if we reach office or in the world in general, we start making change through using our voice. So learning how to master that is a lifelong journey. So a lot of the time, we can decline to use our voice. We can fall into silence. And Jen and I, we're going to talk about those reasons. Some of that is to do with trauma. Some of that is repression and conditioning. Some of that is just political issues around power and gender and race. So it's intersectional. How we use our voice is a matter of power distribution in the world. That's what we call intersectional. So this is an interesting thing, that not everybody has the power to use their voice. It's how those in power control others, is through silencing the voice. So finding that voice is part of our transformation. And the beauty of this discourse is it never showed up anywhere at all except in the feminist literature. And so I'm going to call on a lot of feminist literature today, because why would you talk about the voice as transformative if you've already got it? So it was only those marginalized people, and only within the last 30, 40 years, who recognized they were marginalized because they'd been silenced, and they need to recover the power of their voice to make change. So this discourse of voice and transformation, I will give all credit to feminist literature, because why would you talk about it as transformative if you've already got a platform and a voice, and you've got the vote and you've got all the power? So it didn't enter the psyche of the patriarchal worldview that voice was even an issue. So this is interesting. So feminist literature looks at the intersectionality, as I use that beautiful word, of silence and voice, and who's got that and who doesn't, who gets to tell the story, and who silences other people's stories, and why and how. These are really, really profound questions that affect all marginalized people. Having an understanding of the psychological challenges of speaking up in a world where people want to silence you, because that benefits them for you to keep quiet. So we have a whole history of being silenced if you're a person of color, if you're marginalized in some way with a different sexual orientation, or even if you're a woman. And I just want to give an example of that. I came up through the arts, and at one point I was studying fine art, and I had a big fat book on what's called the canon of fine art, which is photographs of all the great paintings throughout history from the dawn of time 35,000 years ago to now. This big fat book that if you opened it and you were reading it in bed and it fell on you, would kill you. It had so many beautiful images were belonging 99.9% to men. So this is an interesting thing, that there are probably 5 or 6 women in this whole canon whose work was visually represented. So in other words, the whole history of female creativity had been silenced just through how a book is published. And so people have been doing great work on republishing the art canon to show that actually women are equally creative. So that was a wonderful change. But in the same way as you could be denied an exhibition if you're an artist, or your book could be turned down at one point, you'd have to use a pseudonym as a woman, you'd have to use a man's name just to get published. There's a history of various ways that people have been silenced, and it's very subtle. It's exclusion, it's glass ceiling. So it's not just about people putting a tie around your face and saying, keep quiet, you can't speak. It's the whole system is designed to promote some voices and not others. So that's feminist literature tries to deconstruct how that happened and how can we change it, because that's the only way real change can happen. So Jen and I feel this is central to transformation, not only of ourselves and our agency, but of our politics and the way we can actually bring our creativity into the world. So that's my little introduction, and I'd love to hear from Jen, who's practiced using her voice in so many different ways, visually, textually, vocally, gesturally. Back over to you, Jen.
I'm super excited about this because, well, for so many reasons, but I want to just say how important it is that you're bringing up the aspect of the relationship between voice and power imbalances, because that is really central to this conversation. And it's important that we frame it that way for a variety of reasons, but mostly so that we can see how it happens systemically in institutionally and politically. And so often we are expected to kind of look away and not pay attention to those things. But when we think about our own voice and reclaiming our own voice, having that lens of systemic power imbalances is really essential, I think. This show is an example of the saying, the proof is in the pudding. Our Radical Emergence Podcast project was born out of Sally and I discovering over our own decades of inner work, not only that we have our own unique voices, but this show is a co-collaboration and exploration into how we can use our voices more effectively to share our stories and our knowledge and the wisdom of our lives. So yeah, this show is kind of, the proof is in the pudding. So voice is really important to explore when we think about transformation, because voice itself is a tool of transformation. It's an essential part of our transformation and development as humans, because it really allows us to express ourselves, right? And also to, our voice allows us to be heard. And expressing ourselves and being heard are very important needs that we have that are often overlooked or not supported. So we need to look at this dynamic of voice. What is it? How do we lose it? How do we reclaim it? And then once we reclaim it, how do we use it effectively and generatively in service to healing ourselves ongoing and also collective healing, ecological healing. And finding our voice isn't just about finding our outer voice, right? That's really important. But also what's important to this conversation is finding our inner voice, which is equally important. It's so common that when we are run by our trauma and we're being unconsciously driven by our trauma, that our inner voice is actually the voice of others. Our inner voice is the voice of our early caretakers who may not have been kind to us or may not have been supportive, right? So our inner voice therefore becomes really toxic and self-destructive. And that was very true for me. So when we talk about reclaiming voice, we're not just talking about our literal voice in the world, but also reclaiming the voice of our inner world and how we can reclaim that voice so we're not being run by our unconscious trauma and our unconscious negative self-talk. So looking back at my own journey, so much of my voice was masked by and occluded by self-doubt. So often I didn't use my voice in situations where I should have or could have because I was really afraid of what people would think. And because I wasn't grounded in myself. And because of that fear, I really restrained my voice. And even when I did use my voice, I would still question what I was saying. So I spent a lot of my healing journey healing that pattern of self-doubt. And that's a product, that self-doubt is a byproduct of being raised in an early home environment where my voice wasn't supported, where it wasn't honored, and sometimes even wasn't even tolerated. So there was a suppression of my voice. And now as I'm on this healing journey, I'm reclaiming my voice. And one way that I'm doing that is by really respecting myself, respecting my perspectives. I'm going back to that younger Jen who was suppressed and not tolerated and validating the importance of her voice. I'm bringing her with me into the present and allowing her to speak through me, right? Because she has a valuable message that was suppressed. And so I'm giving the opportunity for all of my suppressed voices of the past to communicate through me. And even if that means I'm saying something wrong, even if that means saying an uncomfortable thing, whatever it takes, I'm going to say it, even if it embarrasses me. In the words of activist and founder of the Gray Panthers, Maggie Kuhn, she said, "Speak your truth, even if your voice shakes." And that's really hard, isn't it? It's hard to speak even when our nervous system is saying no. To go against that social pressure, like Sally was talking about, to go against that suppression and the expectations that society puts on them, that takes real bravery. And, our voices get so often suppressed by that expectation for conformity. And that conformity sits within those power imbalances that Sally is pointing us to. Because sharing our perspectives could get us ostracized, could get us put out on the outside, and nobody wants, right? That nobody wants that because we're social creatures. We want to belong. And so often when we use our voice, suddenly we don't belong anymore. We may even be on our own. And that's really scary, especially if we have early childhood trauma. That can be really frightening. So working through those fears and self-doubt takes real diligence and a commitment to really challenge ourselves and continuing challenging ourselves, even when it's super painful. We're dealing with really highly embedded patterns of behavior that have been there probably for many of us for decades, since childhood. And, in order to uproot those beliefs, it takes courage. So finding your voice, claiming your voice and using your voice is a courageous act. And it is really one of the most powerful ways that we can engage with transformation, both our inner transformation and outer transformation, which of course are fractally connected, right? Because the inner and outer are actually one. So yeah, I'll stop there. And I really am stoked to go deeper with you, Sally, into this journey of how we can, what's keeping us from finding our voice, using our voice. I'm really interested in what you feel about that.
Yeah, that's such a great question, Jen. What's keeping us from using our voice? I ask my clients as an expressive arts therapist to sit with that question. It's pivotal. What is keeping us from finding our voice? And so we can actually track our history, going back to our family of origin. What were the messages that you might have got from your family? For me, I was brought up in a British style of household. So you often had stiff upper lip. That was a phrase for you don't have to express all your feelings. You can just be stoic. I came from a family that my parents were fairly religious. So in that tradition, girls couldn't even participate in church. You couldn't pray. You couldn't speak the sermon. You couldn't lead. So in public spaces, I was learning that, oh, I'm a girl. My role is to keep quiet and listen to the boys. On social occasions in South Africa, it was very sexist. Around a dinner table, the voices were loud and booming and deep and masculine, and the females were audience. They became audience for the men to vocalize. So obviously things are changing, and this is wonderful. This is just tracking my history. And politically, in South Africa, where there was apartheid, as an artist, we were heavily censored. So the political regime made it very clear that as any artist, a playwright, a painter, a book writer, even people in public office, if you spoke against the system, you could literally disappear overnight, be imprisoned, and you would disappear forever. You would be killed and your body would never be seen again. So this was a contemporary Nazi regime, and it took it to the extreme. Your products, cultural products, were banned. What does that mean? They were not allowed to be published. They were not allowed to be read. They were not allowed to be spoken about. You could not advertise or market them. Your groups of associations were restricted. Now, the reason I'm talking about this, even though it's history, is that I see some of this happening again in America, in the States, this banning of books, the restrictions on free speech. It's cyclical. So this is the reason I'm bringing it up, is this has not gone away. This is how regimes recognize that artists and people with voice have power and that they should be silenced. Now, this is what we would call the beginning of fascism. So it's deeply concerning for me as an expressive arts therapist, noticing that I'm helping people find their voice, to find their power and their agency, and politically, that can become very dangerous. So we're always playing with power when we talk about finding the voice, and you don't need to be an artist to that's a professional voicer. You can just be speaking out against injustice or making a stand somewhere, and you can be trolled if you're on social media. If you happen to talk about gender right now, which I do on other platforms, I'm being trolled. So there are always public pressures on you to silence your voice because, as Jen beautifully said, it's safer. You want to belong. You want to be loved. And that's a great cost to pay. So it takes enormous courage. So people might say, Sally and Jen, wow, you have voices. You've got a platform. What they don't see is a long history of being silenced. And that's why I took up the arts. So just to reassure people who just see Jen and I doing this as if it's easy, we've had decades of tracking what stopped our voice, trying to unblock it, a lot of trauma in both our lives, including family abuse or lots of political stuff that blocked our voices for a long time. And we had to do that work to open up our throat again and find the courage to speak. So that takes work and commitment, and it's a practice. So it might look easy. I just want to reassure any folks here listening, Jen and I have made a lifelong commitment to using our voices. Yeah, and I'd like to hear more about that from you, Jen.
Yes, we have. And, perhaps it's when the voices that get suppressed the most deeply come raging back in the act of reclamation, and reclaiming our voices, because it's such an authentic thing for us. And it's such an insult to the soul, to the spirit, to have that taken away. And somehow deep down, we know it. So many of us know it, but we can't quite, find our way to our voice, or we are haphazardly finding, over the years, as you've said, decades that we've been honing our voice. There's something instinctive in the human that wants to have a voice. And also, as you mentioned, the cyclical nature of oppressing the voice, and how that happens over, generations, even how the dominant paradigm, white supremacy, patriarchy, is particularly interested in maintaining having the only voice in the room, and not allowing others to have voices that are on the margins. I think it's really important to I'm glad you brought that up, of the cyclical nature of that, because what we're dealing with now is what we have been dealing with for probably since the beginning of humanity. And so perhaps every generation we get, maybe we get a little bit freer, a little bit more aware, a little bit more. I do see the younger generation, they have a different relationship, especially Gen Z. They seem to own their voice in a way that, those of us in Gen Xers and baby boomers, and millennials even maybe haven't necessarily had. And so I like to see that. I think that's hopeful that the young folks seem to have an access to their voice, a respect for their own voice that we didn't necessarily have when we were younger. So that's definitely exciting and promising. So one of my passions, as you know, and I've spoken about it on this podcast a lot, and on my platform that I write about, is developing intimacy in our inner world. And that is self-awareness. Self-awareness is just developing intimacy in our inner world. And to find our voice, we need to become more deeply aware of our inner landscape. Because by becoming more aware of our inner landscape and our inner world, we become aware of our limitations. The more aware I am of my inner world, the more I am aware I am of the circumstances that have formed me and shaped me. The pain and trauma and adversity comes into the light. And when I identify those patterns and those factors, and when I start to disrupt them by paying attention to them, right, and gently bringing my attention to them, I free the voice inside of me to speak. As Sally's pointing us to, the throat chakra, as we talked about in our last episode, starts to loosen up, and that hose pipe opens up, and we are free to speak. But in the absence of that awareness, right, without any intimacy within my inner world, I'm likely to continue to censor myself in a variety of ways, mostly because I'm just not aware of those patterns, right? So self-awareness
is critical to our voice. Without that, I can't disrupt my most toxic patterns, my most self-defeating patterns, my patterns of self-harm, right? Of censoring myself. This is why self-awareness is really the most subversive thing we can do in a world that is saturated in these power imbalances that we've been talking about. Reclaiming our power on the inside is one of the most effective and radical ways to subvert those power imbalances. Because once we reclaim our voice and have that intimacy, and we've restored the power within ourselves, that power can never be taken away. And you can literally imprison someone, but their mind is free because they're aware of themselves on the inside. So I would like to end this with a quote from one of my favorite poets and activist, American scholar of Chicana feminism, cultural theory, and queer theory, the one and only Gloria Anzaldúa, who we lost in 2004. And this is what she writes: I will have my voice, Indian, Spanish, white. I will have my serpent's tongue, my woman's voice, my sexual voice, my poet's voice. I will overcome the tradition of silence. All right, Sally, I'm really excited to go just even deeper about how we can overcome that tradition of silence.
Jen, this is so complex, and I'd love to unravel it just a tiny bit. I love the way you said, you know, the inner voice. You were talking about the inner voice and then the external voice and how they're one and the same. But I'd also wanted to just take a brief note that you can have this really noisy mind, as you pointed out. So there's a lot of voices in the head, but they never emerge. That's a difficult place to be health-wise. So there's this wonderful thing called meditation, where you actually learn how to silence the inner voice. And the more you do that, the more your external voice becomes really clear and focused and present. So there's kind of an interesting way of looking at this thing called the voice. Is it just noise that's being ejaculated? And that's a product of a really busy mind that might be seeking attention. Nothing wrong with that. But learning mastery of this chakra can also include, as you age and mature, learning how to be silent. So it's complex. When Jen and I are definitely not saying noise is good, silence is bad. Mastery is always the pair of ducks, the paradox, it's both. Silence and voice. And maturity means knowing when to apply which. And to also notice the silence in the side and the silence in speech outside. So there's a lot going on that we can become aware of. So I'd like to just look at this thing called articulation, which is about expressing your inner world, learning how to do that, and how it's voicing as an act of resistance to being invisible. And we all need, not just want, need to be seen and heard. That's part of building intimacy. Jen is always using that word, intimacy and self-awareness. So being able to articulate that inner world is part of relationship and connecting. This is not just about self-indulgence. It's not even about shifting power, although that's critical. It's also about actually relating to people, which is the cornerstone of mental health. So Jen and I have dedicated this whole one to voice and silence, because we need to track, is the silence from trauma, shame, self-doubt, fear, conditioning? Or is it an act of maturity to keep you safe in an unsafe situation? Because speaking out in some circumstances can be suicidal, for our sisters in Afghanistan, for example. So we're not black and white here saying silence bad, voice good. Judicious use of the voice is good. And listening to the inner voice. So I'd like to just notice that where this impulse comes from for self-expression, there's a somatic impulse that arises in the body that wants to be expressed out through the throat or the hands or whatever we're using. The body is an instrument. And that impulse translates then into symbols, sound, metaphor, semantics. So the somatics become semantics. That's really what we're talking about when we say learning how to voice. It's translating an impulse to reach out into something audible or visible. The body as an instrument. One of my favorite of all time writers, Black feminist lesbian poet Audre Lorde, said this. I love what she had to say. Your silence will not protect you. She said, I have come to believe over and over again that what is most important to me must be spoken, made verbal and shared, even at the risk of having it bruised or misunderstood. Speaking profits me beyond any other effect. Together, we share a war against the tyrannies of silence. But I'm not a casualty. I'm also a warrior. So ask, what are the words you do not yet have? What do you need to say? And what are the tyrannies that you swallow day by day until you will sicken and die of them, still in silence? So I really listen when Black women speak because they have been silenced more than white women. And if our listeners care to follow this up more, there's an amazing Black speaker and writer, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. She has a TED Talk that you can Google that has 33 million views. It's the most amazing TED Talk on the danger of the single story. Well, what does that mean? If we don't use our voice, there will only be one story told. And that is a very dangerous place to be, and your silence will not save you. So we have an obligation to tell our stories, because otherwise there's this competitive a fight for dominance of narratives. And whoever speaks will be the dominant narrative. So traditionally, up till 100 years ago, when women got the vote, there was one narrative. And once we got the vote, we started entering discourse. We are building platforms like this one, podcasts and books and art. And we are literally telling our stories now. And that dominance of narratives will become more democratized the more everybody tells their story. There's a danger to not telling your story. And, you know, great thing of Netflix is, or any of these contemporary movie makers and are documentaries on more and more marginalized and unique stories. And it's wonderful. This is how we change society. This is transformation through the democratization of storytelling. And to do that, you need to find your voice and begin to articulate. So I would like to just say briefly before we leave that Jen and I are going to take a little bit of a break, and I'll let her tell you a bit more about that. We're going to come back refreshed in a couple of weeks, and I'd like to say goodbye and how much I've really enjoyed the 10 weeks together so far, and we've got a lot more coming, but I'm going to hand it over to Jen to finish what she would like to say about voice.
Well, when we have Audra Lord in the house, we know we've come to church because, yeah, I'm with you that I am listening to Black women. And, you mentioned intersectionality and the work of Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined that term and who is so often overlooked as an important voice that speaks about those power imbalances. And so Black women truly are and have been doing this transformative work long before many of us, I know as a white woman, certainly saturated in white supremacy and privilege. I came to this awareness of these power imbalances later in my life because I had the privilege of doing that. And Black women have been in the trenches doing this work for a long time. And so I'm really glad that we're centering them here in this conversation, rightfully so. Yeah, I think you're right. The Netflix phenomenon in the democratization of marginalized voices, there's something really interesting happening. There's an increase in the awareness of the importance of storytelling, as you've said, and you've seen this momentum more and more of telling these unique stories that wouldn't normally have been told. And that's really exciting because sharing our life experiences transforms us on all levels, personally, socially, ecologically, universally. Sharing our stories is transformative. And my favorite thing about our current proliferation of storytelling is the popularity of memoir and sharing our personal narratives. More and more people are reclaiming their voices and sharing their voices. And there's also a lot of visual artists also doing this same momentum. You'll see on my Facebook page where I curate a lot of work of visual artists who are reclaiming voice and what is called situated knowledge, the wisdom of the knowledge that one brings to the table. And these visual artists are sharing that through just such creative, colorful, interesting narratives through art. And there's a real renaissance of creativity happening right now where people who have been traditionally marginalized and not had a voice at the table are using their voices not just for entertainment, but for collective healing. And also I want to say that nature has a voice and that animals have voices. And so often as humans, as I mentioned before, I've been saturated in privilege. And one of those is also the privilege of species. And so often we humans, and I certainly was taught to dominate those voices, and we don't even realize that we are dominating the voices of animals and of our earth home. We silence their voices. We see their experiences having less value than our experiences. And so one way that we can participate with ecological healing is by honoring the experiences and voices of animals. And we can do that by recognizing that every being alive, every sentient being alive is pregnant with its own value, with its own significance. And we need all the voices lifted up and listened to and raised if we are going to make our way out of this entanglement of challenges that we're up against as a species on this planet. And the most important thing we can do as human animals that have the capacity for self-awareness is to respect that voice of the earth, right? Respect the voice of our earth home. Listen to that voice. Our earth home has her own sovereignty, her own voice, and it deserves our respect. And recognizing the earth voice is really central to our survival on this planet. I believe that. So I want to say quickly that developing self-confidence is another thing that we can do to find our voice. And there's a bunch of ways we can do that. One thing that I did before we started this podcast is that I hired a voice coach. And, she taught me all kinds of exercises to do with my mouth and, trying to open up this area and speak from a different place. And so I found it really liberating just to hear someone recognize my actual voice. A lot of us really don't like to hear the sound of our voice. And when we hear it, we're like, well, what's that about, right? So one way that we can reclaim our voice is also by just appreciating the sound of our voice and our tone. And also get involved in your community and find ways to express yourself. Find mentors who are using their voice in the way you want to use your voice. Look for creative experiences on opportunities, mediums of art are an excellent way to discover your voice and express your voice. Join conversations where others are using their voices and advocating for the causes that we care about. And also what's really important is don't be afraid to experiment, to say the embarrassing thing, to fail, to fall flat on your face. And don't be afraid to be seen trying, because at the end of the day, we are social creatures. We are social creatures that are constantly learning from each other in what's called social construction. And so we're constantly learning. And this is especially true when it comes to voice. We get more confident to use our voice when we are around and exposed to people who are using their voices. So I want to say thank you for listening. And we hope that this episode helps you find your voice and find confidence in your voice. We hope that finding our voice helps you use your voice more in the world. As Sally mentioned, the two of us are going through some pretty major life experiences right now. We were musing before we started the show today that when you engage with transformation, transformation also engages with you. And so we find ourselves in a really tumultuous time personally. And so we're going to take a couple weeks off. I'm moving out of state. And so I will be coming to you from a different location next time. But we have half of our project done and another half to go. So we look forward to a little bit of a rest and reset over the next few weeks and coming back to you and re-emerging into this container with new vision in a new place. And so, we look forward to continuing our journey into a universe of transformation in July. Thank you for your time and take care and be well.
So thanks for joining us. And we hope you can take away some helpful tools, perhaps some great stories, and some wisdom for your own ongoing journey.
Join us for our next episode, where we will deep dive again into a universe of transformation.